Good evening all and welcome back to Untold Fears. Tonight we venture into Alaska during the most terrifying time of year when the sun disappears for months and darkness becomes a living entity that feeds on human fear. 10 souls will share their encounters with horrors that emerge only when civilization cannot see them coming. These are not folklore or legends, but documented accounts from Alaska's endless winter nights where survival depends on more than just warmth. When temperatures drop to deadly lows and help is hundreds of miles away, the predators know exactly when to strike. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Untold Fears for daily true horror content that will keep you up at night. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when the darkness calls. Now, let us step into the shadows of the Alaskan wilderness, where civilization ends and terror begins. My name is Jalen, and I am a 26-year-old marine biologist. What happened to me at the Kodiak Fisheries Research Center during the winter of 2022 still haunts my dreams every single night. I have shared this story with exactly 3 people in my life, and each time I tell it, they look at me like I have lost my mind. But I know what I witnessed during those 63 days of darkness, and I know that some horrors cannot be explained by science alone. I arrived at the Kodiak Fisheries Research Center in early November 2022 as part of a joint research project studying the effects of climate change on Alaska's marine ecosystem. The timing was intentional. We needed to collect data during the harshest winter months, when most researchers avoided the area entirely. Our team consisted of 8 people, including myself, and we were scheduled to remain at the facility until late January when the sun would finally return to give us more than just a few hours of twilight each day. The research center itself is an impressive 45,000 square foot facility located on Near Island, just outside Kodiak proper. During summer months, it bustles with visiting scientists, students, and tourists who come to see the interpretive displays and touch tanks filled with local marine life. But in November, as the polar night approached, we were completely isolated. The dormitory building that normally housed dozens of researchers was occupied by just our small team, and the vast laboratories echoed with an emptiness that made every footstep sound like thunder. Dr. Marcus Chen was our team leader, a brilliant oceanographer in his 50s who had spent decades studying Arctic waters. Sarah Martinez, our climatologist, was responsible for monitoring temperature and weather patterns. The 3 graduate students, David, Emma, and Tyler, were there to assist with sample collection and data entry. Then there was Dr. Lila Petrov, our marine pathologist, and Jake Morrison, our equipment technician, and me, tasked with studying the behavior patterns of deepwater fish species during extreme seasonal changes. The first few weeks proceeded normally. We established our routines, collected our samples, and adapted to the gradually decreasing daylight hours. By mid-November, we were experiencing only 3 hours of dim twilight each day, and by late November, even that disappeared entirely. The research center's artificial lighting became our only connection to any sense of normal time. But even then, the oppressive darkness outside seemed to seep through every window and doorway. It was during our 3rd week of complete darkness that I first noticed something was wrong with Dr. Petrov. Lila had always been intense about her work, often staying late in the marine pathology lab to examine tissue samples and conduct her research. But her behavior began changing in subtle ways that initially seemed like normal responses to the isolation and darkness we were all experiencing. She started spending even more hours in her lab, often working through the night and sleeping during what we had designated as daytime hours. When she did join us for meals in the communal dining area, she appeared pale and withdrawn, barely touching her food and avoiding eye contact with the rest of the team. Dark circles formed under her eyes, and her normally meticulous appearance became disheveled and careless. Dr. Chen attributed her behavior to seasonal affective disorder. something we had all been warned about before accepting this assignment. The complete lack of sunlight for extended periods could cause severe depression, sleep disruption, and behavioral changes in even the most mentally stable individuals. We increased the brightness of our light therapy lamps and encouraged Lila to spend more time in the common areas, but she continued to isolate herself. The first truly disturbing incident occurred during our 4th week of darkness. I was working late in my own lab, analyzing fish behavior recordings, when I heard strange sounds coming from the marine pathology lab down the hall. It was nearly 2 in the morning, and I assumed Lila was once again working through the night. The sounds were rhythmic and wet, like something being torn or chewed, followed by long periods of silence. Concerned for her well-being, I walked down the corridor toward her lab. The sound of my footsteps seemed unnaturally loud in the empty hallway, and I could feel my heart rate increasing with each step. When I reached her lab door, I knocked gently and called her name but received no response. The wet, tearing sounds continued from inside. I tried the door handle and found it unlocked. Pushing it open slowly, I peered into the dimly lit laboratory. What I saw made my stomach lurch with revulsion and confusion. Lila was hunched over one of the examination tables, and spread before her were the remains of several fish specimens that had been completely torn apart. But she was not dissecting them for research purposes. She was feeding on them, tearing pieces of raw flesh with her bare hands and consuming them with a desperate, animalistic hunger. Her back was turned to me, but I could see her shoulders moving as she fed, and I could hear the wet sounds of her chewing and swallowing. The fish blood had stained her lab coat and hands a dark crimson, and the smell that filled the room was overwhelming. A mixture of dead fish, blood, and something else I could not identify but that made my stomach turn violently. I stood frozen in the doorway for what felt like an eternity, unable to process what I was witnessing. This was Dr. Lila Petrov, a respected marine pathologist with decades of experience and multiple published papers. She held a PhD from Stanford University and had spent her entire career studying marine diseases and tissue analysis. The woman before me, however, appeared to be something else entirely. When she finally sensed my presence and turned around, I saw that her face was smeared with blood and fish scales. Her eyes, which had always been a warm brown color, now appeared to have taken on a strange reddish tint in the laboratory lighting. She looked at me with an expression that was neither embarrassment nor surprise, but something closer to territorial aggression, like a wild animal protecting its kill. We stared at each other for several long seconds before she slowly wiped her mouth with the back of her blood-stained hand and spoke in a voice that sounded hoarse and unfamiliar. "The protein deficiency," she said, as if that explained everything. "The isolation affects nutrient absorption. I need the fresh tissue samples for my research." Her explanation made no scientific sense whatsoever, but in my shock and confusion, I found myself nodding and backing out of the laboratory. I returned to my own lab, but could not concentrate on any work for the remainder of the night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her hunched form feeding on the raw fish flesh, and I could not shake the image from my mind. The next morning, I debated whether to report the incident to Dr. Chen. Lila appeared at breakfast, looking more normal than she had in days, wearing a clean lab coat and having obviously showered and styled her hair. She participated in our morning briefing as if nothing unusual had occurred, discussing her research findings with the same professional competence she had always displayed. I began to wonder if the isolation and darkness were affecting my own perception. Perhaps I had misinterpreted what I witnessed, or maybe the extreme conditions were causing me to hallucinate or exaggerate normal behavior. The human mind can play terrible tricks during extended periods of stress and sensory deprivation. But 3 days later, Tyler made a discovery that validated my concerns and escalated our situation to a genuinely dangerous level. He had been tasked with maintaining our specimen storage freezers, and during a routine inventory check, he discovered that nearly half of our fish samples had been removed from their containers and consumed. The freezer was filled with empty specimen jars and storage bags that had been torn open, their contents completely devoured. Tyler brought his findings to Dr. Chen, who immediately called a team meeting to address what he assumed was a problem with local wildlife somehow accessing our storage facilities. But when he questioned each team member about securing the laboratory spaces, Lila became defensive and agitated in a way that raised everyone's suspicions. The samples were contaminated, she insisted, her voice rising to an almost hysterical pitch. I had to dispose of them according to proper biological safety protocols. The tissue degradation was accelerating beyond acceptable parameters. But Tyler had been monitoring the freezer temperatures daily, and there had been no equipment failures or contamination events. The samples had been stored properly according to all established procedures, and their removal appeared to have been deliberate and systematic. Dr. Chen decided to implement a buddy system for all laboratory work, requiring team members to work in pairs whenever accessing specimen storage or conducting experiments. He also installed additional security cameras in the storage areas, ostensibly to monitor for equipment failures, but actually to observe any unusual activity. Lila's response to these changes was immediate and concerning. She became increasingly paranoid and hostile, accusing the team of questioning her professional competence and suggesting that we were conspiring against her. She began spending even more time isolated in her laboratory, and we would often hear her talking to herself through the walls, though we could never make out the actual words. The breaking point came during our 6th week of darkness, on a night when the temperature outside dropped to nearly 40 degrees below zero. I was awakened around 3 in the morning by the sound of the building's security alarm system. The harsh electronic wailing echoed through the dormitory corridors, and we all rushed to determine what had triggered the alert. Dr. Chen checked the security panel and discovered that multiple exterior doors had been opened simultaneously, including the main laboratory entrance and the emergency exit near the specimen storage area. The outdoor temperature was lethal to anyone without proper protective gear, and we assumed there had been a system malfunction or that someone was experiencing a medical emergency. We quickly dressed in our warmest clothing and divided into search teams to locate whoever might be outside in the deadly cold. Jake and I took the path toward the marine laboratory building, while Dr. Chen and Sarah checked the dormitory perimeter. The graduate students remained inside to monitor communications and coordinate any necessary emergency responses. The darkness outside was absolute and terrifying. Even with our high-powered flashlights, we could see no more than a few feet in any direction, and the wind created an endless howling sound that made communication nearly impossible. The snow had been falling for hours, creating drifts that reached above our knees in some areas. We followed a set of footprints that led from the laboratory building toward the rocky coastline, where the research center's marine specimen collection area was located. The prints were deep and erratic, as if whoever made them had been running or stumbling through the snow without proper winter boots. When we reached the collection area, we found Dr. Lila Petrov kneeling beside one of the outdoor specimen tanks that contained live sea life for research purposes. She had broken through the ice that covered the tank and was pulling out fish, crabs, and other marine creatures with her bare hands. Her clothing was completely inadequate for the temperature, wearing only a thin lab coat over regular clothes, but she showed no signs of distress from the extreme cold. What horrified me most was watching her consume the live specimens immediately after pulling them from the water. She was tearing apart small fish with her teeth and swallowing them whole, and she had already consumed several crabs, shells, and all. The sounds she made while feeding were animalistic and desperate, unlike anything I had ever heard from a human being. Jake shouted her name and started moving toward her, but she looked up at us with an expression of pure rage and bared her teeth like a wild animal defending its territory. Her face and hands were covered in blood and seawater, and in the beam of our flashlights, I could see that her fingernails had somehow become elongated and claw-like. She made a sound that was somewhere between a growl and a scream, then grabbed another fish from the tank and bit into it so violently that blood sprayed across the snow around her. Jake and I both stepped backward instinctively, realizing that we were not dealing with normal human behavior or even a typical psychological breakdown. Dr. Chen and Sarah arrived moments later, and together we managed to convince Lila to return to the building. She did not speak during the entire walk back, but she continued to make low growling sounds and repeatedly looked back toward the specimen tanks as if planning to return. Once inside, we contacted the Coast Guard to arrange for an emergency medical evacuation. The weather conditions made helicopter transport impossible, but they assured us that a rescue team would reach us as soon as the storm cleared, probably within 24 hours. We secured Lila in one of the dormitory rooms and took shifts monitoring her throughout the night. Her behavior continued to deteriorate, and by morning, she was speaking in languages none of us recognized and clawing at the walls with her bare hands until her fingernails were bloody and torn. The medical evacuation team arrived the following afternoon and immediately sedated Lila for transport to Anchorage. The paramedics told us that her symptoms suggested severe nutritional deficiency combined with acute psychotic episode, possibly triggered by vitamin D deficiency and seasonal affective disorder. But I knew what I had witnessed was something beyond normal medical explanation. The way she fed on raw flesh, her apparent immunity to the deadly cold, and the physical changes in her appearance suggested something far more disturbing than psychological breakdown. 3 months later, I received a call from the psychiatric facility where Lila had been treated. She had made a full recovery after receiving vitamin D supplementation, light therapy, and nutritional rehabilitation. According to her doctors, the extreme isolation and lack of sunlight had caused her body to develop desperate cravings for certain nutrients that manifested as aberrant feeding behavior. But I still wake up every night remembering the sound of her feeding on those live specimens, and I cannot shake the feeling that the darkness of the Alaskan winter had awakened something in her that should have remained sleeping forever. My name is Kalen, and I am a 31-year-old social worker with the North Slope Borough Health and Social Services Department in Utqiagvik, Alaska. What I experienced during the polar night of 2021 changed everything I thought I knew about human evil and the darkness that can consume both the landscape and the soul. The case files are sealed, the official reports have been classified, but the memories of those 65 days without sunlight will haunt me until my dying breath. I moved to Utqiagvik in September 2021 to work with the Community Health Services Division, specifically focusing on missing persons cases and family crisis intervention. The town, formerly known as Barrow, sits at the northernmost point of the United States, more than 300 miles above the Arctic Circle. During summer months, the sun never sets, but during winter, it disappears completely for over 2 months, creating a psychological environment that can break even the strongest minds. My supervisor, Elena Tomagak, had warned me about the challenges of working in such an isolated community during polar night. The combination of extreme cold, complete darkness, and geographic isolation creates unique social problems that most social workers never encounter. Domestic violence rates increase, alcohol abuse becomes more prevalent, and mental health crises spike dramatically during the months without sunlight. But nothing could have prepared me for what began happening in early December, just 2 weeks after the sun disappeared for what would be the final time until late January. 3 women had gone missing in the span of 10 days, all between the ages of 19 and 28, all last seen during the evening hours when most residents were at home trying to maintain some semblance of normal routine. The first was Maria Kanguk, a 23-year-old teacher at the local elementary school. She'd been walking home from a colleague's house around 7 in the evening a journey that should have taken less than 15 minutes. Her roommate called the police when she failed to return home by midnight, but the initial investigation found no signs of struggle or foul play along her usual route. Sarah Utqiagvik disappeared 3 days later. The 19-year-old college student was attending the University of Alaska Fairbanks, but had returned home for winter break. She was last seen leaving the local community center after a cultural event celebrating traditional Inupiaq storytelling. Like Maria, she simply vanished without leaving any trace of what might have happened to her. The third disappearance sent the entire community into a state of panic that I had never witnessed before. Jessica Brower, a 28-year-old nurse at the Samuel Simmons Memorial Hospital, was abducted from the hospital parking lot after finishing her evening shift. Security cameras captured footage of her walking to her vehicle, but the recording showed her suddenly stopping and turning toward something outside the camera's field of view, then simply disappearing from the frame entirely. As the social worker assigned to coordinate with family members and community resources, I found myself working closely with Alaska State Troopers and local law enforcement to understand what might be happening to these women. The isolation of Utqiagvik meant that whoever was responsible had to be someone local, someone who understood the community well enough to move through it undetected during the darkest time of the year. Trooper Lieutenant David Harrison had been investigating similar disappearances across Alaska for nearly 15 years, and he immediately recognized patterns that reminded him of cases from the 1970s and early 1980s. He explained to me that Alaska had a history of serial predators who used the state's vast wilderness and extreme weather conditions to hunt human beings like animals. Robert Hansen killed at least 17 women between 1971 and 1983, he told me during one of our case briefings. He would abduct them from Anchorage, fly them to remote locations in his private plane, then hunt them down with a rifle. The isolation and harsh environment made it nearly impossible for victims to escape or for investigators to find evidence. But Utqiagvik presented a different set of challenges for both predator and investigator. The town has fewer than 5,000 residents. Everyone knows everyone else. And during polar night, there are very few places to hide or dispose of evidence. Whoever was taking these women had to be extremely familiar with the local geography and community routines. The breakthrough came during our 4th week of investigation, when electronic records revealed a pattern that none of us had initially noticed. All 3 women had been contacted by someone using various social media platforms and dating applications during the weeks before their disappearances. The messages appeared to come from different accounts, but they all followed similar patterns of conversation that suggested the same person was behind all of them. The messaging always began with compliments about the women's appearances, followed by requests to meet in person for coffee or casual dates. The language used was articulate and charming, showing knowledge of local events and community members that made the communications seem legitimate and trustworthy. Each woman had agreed to meet their online contact, though none had told friends or family members about these planned encounters. Technical analysis of the social media accounts revealed that they were all created using the same computer and internet connection, traced to a location within Utqiagvik itself. The IP address belonged to a computer at the local library, which meant that whoever was creating these fake profiles had regular access to the building and understood how to avoid security cameras and digital tracking. Lieutenant Harrison worked with library staff to review security footage from the days when the fake accounts had been created and used. The process was painstaking, requiring us to examine hours of low-quality surveillance recordings, but eventually we identified a person who appeared in the library during all the relevant time periods. Thomas Akuchuk was a 42-year-old maintenance worker for the North Slope Borough who had lived in Utqiagvik his entire life. He worked various jobs around town, including snow removal, building maintenance, and equipment repair, which gave him access to many locations and allowed him to move through the community without attracting attention. His employment records showed that he had been working near all 3 locations where the women disappeared. But Thomas was also someone I knew personally from my work with social services. 3 months earlier, I had been involved in a domestic violence intervention at his home, where his wife had accused him of increasingly erratic and violent behavior during the weeks leading up to Polar Night. She described mood swings, paranoid thoughts about neighbors and co-workers, and violent fantasies that he had begun expressing during arguments. His wife, Linda, had ultimately decided not to press charges and had refused to leave their home despite recommendations from our department. She explained that Thomas had always struggled with seasonal depression and that his behavior typically improved once the sun returned in late January. However, she admitted that his symptoms seemed worse during the 2021 Polar Night than she had ever seen them before. When Lieutenant Harrison and local police attempted to locate Thomas for questioning, they discovered that he had not reported to work in over a week and that his wife had not seen him in 3 days. His pickup truck was missing from their driveway, and neighbors reported seeing him loading camping equipment and hunting supplies into the vehicle several nights earlier. The search for Thomas led us to an abandoned hunting cabin approximately 15 miles outside of town, accessible only by snowmobile or specialized Arctic vehicles. The cabin had been used by local hunters for decades, but had been officially closed due to structural problems and safety concerns. However, recent snowmobile tracks suggested that someone had been using it regularly despite the closure. When search teams reached the cabin, they found evidence that Thomas had been living there intermittently for several weeks. Sleeping bags, food supplies, and personal belongings suggested that he had been using the location as a base of operations while conducting activities that he wanted to keep hidden from the community. More disturbing were the items that indicated he had been holding people at the cabin against their will. Rope, handcuffs, and restraining devices were found in the main room, along with clothing that family members later identified as belonging to the 3 missing women. Blood stains on the floor and walls suggested that violence had occurred, though no bodies were discovered at the scene. The investigation revealed that Thomas had been following patterns similar to those used by Robert Hansen decades earlier, but adapted for the unique environment of the Arctic Polar Night. Instead of using an airplane to transport victims to remote locations, he had been using his knowledge of local hunting cabins and abandoned structures to create a network of hidden sites where he could hold and torture his victims without detection. GPS tracking data from his cell phone, recovered from the cabin, showed that he had visited at least 6 different remote locations during the weeks when the women disappeared. Search teams were deployed to each of these sites, but the extreme weather conditions and limited daylight hours made the process dangerous and time-consuming. The final confrontation occurred during our 6th week of Polar Night, when temperatures had dropped nearly 50 degrees below zero and wind conditions made travel extremely hazardous. Thomas had returned to his home to collect additional supplies, apparently believing that the weather would prevent law enforcement from tracking him effectively. Linda called the police when she discovered him in their garage loading ammunition and hunting equipment into his truck. She later told investigators that he appeared to have lost significant weight and that his behavior had become completely irrational, talking to himself and expressing paranoid beliefs about various community members conspiring against him. When police arrived at the residence, Thomas barricaded himself inside the house and refused to surrender. During the 6-hour standoff that followed, he made several statements over his CB radio that suggested he had killed the 3 missing women and had disposed of their bodies in locations where they would never be found. The siege ended when tactical officers used flashbang grenades to disorient Thomas and entered the house through multiple entry points simultaneously. He was found in the basement suffering from severe hypothermia and malnutrition, apparently having been living outdoors in subarctic conditions for several weeks. Thomas was transported to the hospital in Anchorage for medical treatment and psychological evaluation. During his recovery, he provided detailed confessions about the murders of Maria, Sarah, and Jessica, describing how he had lured each woman to remote locations where he tortured and killed them before disposing of their bodies in permanently frozen ground that would preserve evidence indefinitely. He also confessed to the murders of 4 additional women over the past 8 years, all during polar night periods when the darkness and isolation provided perfect conditions for hunting human prey. Like Robert Hansen, he had developed an obsession with the idea of humans as the ultimate hunting challenge, but had adapted his methods to take advantage of Utqiagvik's unique geographic and social environment. The bodies of all 7 women were eventually recovered from various locations around Utqiagvik, though the process took nearly 2 years and required specialized equipment to excavate remains from permanently frozen ground. Thomas was sentenced to 7 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole and is currently serving his sentence at a maximum security facility in Anchorage. The case officially closed in December 2022, exactly 1 year after the first disappearance, but the impact on our community continues to this day. During polar night, residents no longer walk alone after dark, and our social services department has implemented new protocols for monitoring individuals who show signs of seasonal psychological distress. Every year, when the sun disappears in November, I remember those 65 days when we hunted a human predator through the endless darkness of the Arctic winter. The polar night reveals things about human nature that should remain hidden. And sometimes, the most dangerous predators are the ones who know exactly how to use that darkness to their advantage. My name is Janae, and I am a 24-year-old professional photographer specializing in aurora borealis documentation. What happened to me during a 3-week photography expedition near Fairbanks, Alaska in February 2023 challenged everything I believed about the natural world and the boundary between the living and the dead. The images I captured during those nights are locked away in a storage unit in Anchorage, and I have never shown them to another human being because no one would believe what they reveal about the spirits that dance within the northern lights. I had been planning this expedition for over 2 years, saving money and researching the perfect location to capture award-winning aurora photographs during peak activity season. My equipment included a Canon R5 mirrorless camera, multiple wide-angle lenses, carbon fiber tripods, and specialized cold weather battery systems that could function in temperatures as low as 50 degrees below zero. Everything about this trip had been meticulously planned to maximize my chances of documenting the aurora borealis during what meteorologists predicted would be exceptional solar storm activity. The cabin I rented was located approximately 45 miles northeast of Fairbanks, positioned on elevated terrain that provided an unobstructed 360-degree view of the night sky. Built in the 1970s as a hunting lodge, it had been converted into a photographer's retreat, complete with darkroom facilities, equipment storage, and multiple observation decks designed specifically for astronomical photography. The nearest neighbor was more than 8 miles away, ensuring complete darkness and minimal light pollution during shooting sessions. I arrived at the cabin on February 12th, during a period when Fairbanks was experiencing nearly 19 hours of darkness each day. The drive from town took almost 2 hours due to icy road conditions and several wrong turns on unmarked Forest Service roads. But when I finally reached the property, I knew immediately that I had found the perfect location for my project. The cabin sat atop a ridge surrounded by dense stands of white spruce and paper birch trees, with clear sight lines toward the northern and western horizons where aurora activity would be most visible. During my first night, I spent several hours setting up my equipment and testing camera settings, capturing practice shots of the star-filled sky while waiting for aurora activity to begin. The first signs of the northern lights appeared around 10:30 that evening, beginning as a faint green glow along the northern horizon that gradually intensified and spread across the sky. Within 30 minutes, brilliant curtains of green, blue, and purple light were dancing overhead in patterns that shifted and changed faster than I could adjust my camera settings to capture them effectively. I worked through the night, moving between different vantage points around the cabin and experimenting with various exposure times and focal lengths to document the aurora display from multiple perspectives. The light show continued until nearly 4 in the morning, providing me with dozens of exceptional photographs that exceeded my highest expectations for the expedition. But when I reviewed the images on my camera's LCD screen, I noticed details that I had not observed while shooting. Within the swirling patterns of aurora light, there appeared to be humanoid figures, translucent forms that seemed to be moving independently of the electromagnetic phenomena that creates the northern lights. At first, I attributed these apparent shapes to pareidolia, the psychological tendency to perceive familiar forms in random patterns, similar to seeing faces in clouds or shadows. However, as I continued shooting over the following nights, the figures became more distinct and numerous, appearing consistently across multiple photographs taken with different cameras and lenses. The shapes were clearly humanoid, ranging in apparent size from small children to full-grown adults, and they appeared to be wearing traditional indigenous clothing, including parkas, mukluks, and fur-trimmed hoods. More disturbing was the fact that these figures seemed to be watching me. In photograph after photograph, multiple entities appeared to be oriented toward my location, as if they were aware of my presence and were observing my activities. Some appeared to be pointing in my direction, while others seemed to be gesturing to additional figures outside the camera's field of view. During my third night at the cabin, the aurora activity was particularly intense, with brilliant displays visible from sunset until sunrise. I had positioned myself on the main observation deck with 3 cameras running simultaneously, using intervalometer timers to capture long exposure sequences automatically, while I monitored aurora prediction websites and adjusted settings between shots. Around midnight, during a period of exceptional aurora activity that filled nearly the entire sky with shifting patterns of colored light, I began hearing sounds that were not consistent with the normal night sounds of the Alaskan wilderness. At first, it was a low humming or singing that seemed to come from the aurora itself, a sound that reminded me of traditional throat singing, but with multiple overlapping voices, creating complex harmonic patterns. The singing grew louder and more distinct as the aurora activity intensified, and I began to understand that the sounds were not coming from the electromagnetic phenomena in the upper atmosphere, but from somewhere much closer to ground level. The voices seemed to be surrounding the cabin, moving through the forest in patterns that corresponded to the movement of the lights overhead. I continued photographing throughout these experiences, partly because I was determined to complete my project despite the unsettling circumstances, and partly because I hoped the camera might capture evidence of whatever was causing these phenomena. The digital sensors in modern cameras can sometimes detect light wavelengths and electromagnetic activity that are invisible to human eyes, and I thought it might be possible to document scientifically whatever was creating these apparent manifestations. When I reviewed the night's photographs the following morning, I discovered that the figures in the aurora were no longer confined to the upper atmosphere. Ground-level images showed translucent humanoid forms moving between the trees around the cabin, and several photographs captured what appeared to be faces peering through the windows of the building itself. The figures varied in age and appearance, but all were dressed in traditional Athabaskan or Inuit clothing styles that suggested they represented indigenous people who had lived in the region in previous centuries. Some appeared to be carrying traditional tools and weapons, including spears, bows, and carved implements that I could not identify. Most troubling were the images that showed these entities apparently attempting to interact with my photography equipment. Several photographs captured figures standing directly beside my tripod-mounted cameras, their translucent hands reaching toward the lenses, or camera bodies as if they were trying to touch or manipulate the equipment. During my 4th night at the cabin, the paranormal activity escalated beyond simple visual manifestations. I was awakened around 2 in the morning by the sound of footsteps on the cabin's wooden floors, accompanied by voices speaking in languages I did not recognize but which sounded similar to indigenous Alaskan dialects I had heard in documentary recordings. The voices seemed to be coming from multiple locations within the cabin simultaneously, as if several entities were moving through the building independently. I could hear conversations taking place in the main room, the kitchen, and the upstairs loft area, all occurring at the same time in what appeared to be different languages or dialects. When I grabbed my camera and attempted to photograph the interior of the cabin during these incidents, the entities seemed to respond to the flash by becoming more active and agitated. The voices grew louder and more urgent, and I began hearing sounds that suggested the spirits were moving furniture and manipulating objects throughout the building. I spent the remainder of the night barricaded in the bedroom with my cameras and laptop, reviewing the photographs I had captured and trying to understand what I was experiencing. The digital images showed clear evidence of multiple entities moving through the cabin, but they also revealed details that were even more disturbing than simple apparitions. The spirits appeared to be pointing toward specific locations around the property, and in several photographs I could see what looked like additional figures standing in those indicated areas. It was as if the entities within the cabin were directing my attention toward other manifestations that were positioned throughout the surrounding forest. The next morning, I decided to investigate the locations that the spirits had appeared to indicate in the photographs. Using GPS coordinates derived from the metadata in my images, I was able to identify the specific areas where the outdoor entities had been standing, and I hiked to each location to see what might be drawing their attention. At the first location, approximately 200 yards northeast of the cabin, I discovered the remains of what appeared to be a traditional indigenous shelter or temporary camp. Partially buried under decades of fallen leaves and snow, I found fragments of worked wood, carved bone tools, and pieces of sewn hide that suggested the site had been used by native Alaskan hunters or travelers many years ago. The second location revealed similar evidence of previous human occupation, including fire-blackened stones arranged in a circle that had obviously been used for cooking or heating. Metal artifacts scattered around the area suggested the site might have been used during the early 20th century, possibly by indigenous families who had not yet been relocated to established villages or settlements. But the third location contained discoveries that completely changed my understanding of what I had been experiencing. Partially concealed beneath a fallen spruce tree, I found human remains that appeared to have been there for several decades. The bones were scattered and incomplete, suggesting that the bodies had been disturbed by wildlife over time, but clothing fragments and personal items indicated that multiple individuals had died at this location. Among the artifacts were traditional indigenous tools and ornaments that matched the items I had seen the spirits carrying in my photographs. A carved bone spear point found near the remains was nearly identical to weapons that appeared in several of my Aurora images, and pieces of fur-trimmed parka material corresponded to the clothing styles worn by the entities I had been documenting. I realized that the spirits appearing in my photographs were not random paranormal manifestations, but specific individuals who had died in the area around the cabin and whose remains had never been properly recovered or buried according to traditional customs. The entities were attempting to communicate with me, trying to draw attention to their abandoned bodies so that appropriate spiritual rituals could be performed. Research conducted after I returned to Fairbanks revealed that the area around the cabin had a tragic history that had been largely forgotten by local residents. During the harsh winter of 1942, a family of Athabaskan hunters had become lost during a blizzard while traveling between seasonal camps. Their bodies were never recovered, despite extensive search efforts by tribal members and territorial authorities. According to tribal elders I spoke with, the spirits of individuals who die alone in the wilderness without proper burial ceremonies can become trapped in the physical world, unable to proceed to the spiritual realm until their remains are discovered and appropriate rituals are performed. The Aurora Borealis, which plays an important role in traditional Athabascan spiritual beliefs, provides a conduit through which these trapped spirits can manifest and attempt to communicate with the living. The elders explained that my photography equipment had made me particularly sensitive to spiritual manifestations because cameras can sometimes capture electromagnetic disturbances created by paranormal entities. The spirits had recognized that I possessed the ability to see and document their presence, and they had used my visit to the area as an opportunity to reveal the location of their remains. Following guidance provided by tribal spiritual leaders, I arranged for the proper recovery and burial of the remains I had discovered. Traditional ceremonies were performed to honor the deceased and help their spirits find peace in the spiritual realm. The entire process took several weeks and required coordination between tribal authorities, state archaeological officials, and spiritual leaders from multiple communities. When I returned to the cabin several months later to complete my Aurora photography project, the paranormal activity had completely ceased. The Northern Lights displays were as spectacular as before, but my photographs no longer showed any evidence of spiritual entities or supernatural manifestations. The images I captured during that first expedition remained stored and unseen, containing documentation of phenomena that exist beyond the boundaries of conventional scientific understanding. But the experience taught me that some aspects of the natural world cannot be explained through technology and measurement alone, and that there are spirits dwelling within the Aurora that have stories they desperately need to tell. My name is Jaslyn, and I am a 29-year-old emergency dispatcher with the Anchorage Police Department. What I experienced during a single 12-hour shift in December 2020 tested every protocol I had ever learned and forced me to coordinate the most terrifying manhunt in my career. The caller's voice still echoes in my nightmares, and the decisions I made during those dark December hours saved a life while revealing the depths of human evil that can emerge during Alaska's endless winter nights. I had been working as a 911 dispatcher for 6 years when this incident occurred, handling everything from domestic violence calls to major vehicle accidents during Alaska's most dangerous driving season. December in Anchorage means nearly 19 hours of darkness each day, with temperatures that regularly drop below zero and weather conditions that can make emergency response extremely challenging. Our call volume typically increases during polar night months due to seasonal depression, alcohol-related incidents, and the general psychological stress of living with minimal daylight. The call came in at 11:47 p.m. on December 18th, during what had been a relatively quiet evening shift. Most of our activity had been routine traffic accidents and noise complaints, the typical problems that arise when people are confined indoors by sub-zero temperatures and limited daylight hours. When my computer screen indicated an incoming emergency call, I expected another stranded motorist or domestic dispute. 911. What is your emergency? I answered, following standard protocol while pulling up the caller location data on my secondary monitor. The voice that responded was female, young, and filled with a terror that immediately put me on high alert. She was whispering urgently, her words coming in rushed bursts, punctuated by periods of silence during which I could hear her breathing heavily. "Someone is following me," she said. "He has been chasing me for over an hour. I am hiding behind a dumpster near the downtown transit center, but I think he knows where I am." The caller identification system showed the emergency call was coming from a cell phone registered to Rebecca Chen, age 26, with a registered address in the Spennard neighborhood. The GPS coordinates placed her approximately 3 blocks from the downtown Anchorage Transit Center, in an area known for late-night foot traffic and multiple businesses that stayed open during evening hours. "Rebecca, my name is Jaslyn, and I am going to help you," I said, using the calm, professional tone we are trained to maintain during crisis situations. "Can you tell me more about the person following you? What does he look like, and how long has this been going on?" Her response came in fragments as she tried to keep her voice quiet while providing information. She explained that she had been walking home from her job at a downtown restaurant around 10:30 p.m. when she first noticed a man approximately 50 feet behind her. Initially, she assumed it was coincidental, but when she turned several corners and crossed multiple streets, the figure continued to maintain the same distance behind her. "He is wearing dark clothing and a ski mask," she whispered. "Every time I stop, he stops. When I speed up, he matches my pace. I tried to lose him by going into different stores, but he waits outside until I come out, then starts following me again." I immediately dispatched 2 patrol units to the area while continuing to gather information about Rebecca's situation. Standard protocol required me to keep the caller on the line, provide reassurance, and coordinate with responding officers to locate both the victim and potential suspect as quickly as possible. Rebecca described her pursuer as approximately 6 feet tall with a medium build, wearing a black winter parka and dark pants. He appeared to be carrying some kind of bag or backpack, and she had observed him using what looked like a cell phone or radio device several times during the pursuit. Most disturbing was her observation that he seemed to know the downtown area extremely well, taking shortcuts and alternate routes that suggested he was familiar with the local geography. "He is not just following me randomly," she said, her voice becoming more urgent. "He knows exactly where I am going before I do. When I tried to go into the all-night convenience store on 5th Avenue, he was already waiting near the entrance when I got there." This information suggested that the pursuer had been conducting surveillance on Rebecca for some time, possibly learning her routines and preferred routes through downtown Anchorage. The level of preparation and familiarity with her movements indicated a deliberate stalking situation, rather than a random encounter. Officers Martinez and Thompson arrived in the area within 8 minutes of dispatch, but locating Rebecca in the maze of downtown buildings, parking lots, and alleyways proved challenging. The darkness and sub-zero temperatures meant that visibility was extremely limited, and most businesses in the area had closed hours earlier, leaving few sources of artificial lighting. I guided the officers toward Rebecca's GPS location while maintaining contact with her through the emergency line. She had moved from the dumpster area and was now hiding in the recessed doorway of a closed office building, trying to stay out of sight while keeping warm in the dangerous cold. "The officers are very close to your location," I told her. "Can you see any police vehicles or emergency lights in your area?" "No," she whispered, "but I can still see him. He is standing under the streetlight near the corner of 4th and G Street, just watching and waiting. I think he knows the police are coming because he keeps looking around like he is planning something." This development concerned me greatly because it suggested the suspect might be monitoring police radio frequencies or had some other method of tracking law enforcement response. I immediately contacted Sergeant Williams to request additional units and to implement communication protocols designed to prevent suspect evasion. Officer Martinez reported that he had visual contact with an individual matching the suspect description, standing near the intersection Rebecca had mentioned. The figure appeared to be observing the area systematically and showed signs of awareness regarding police presence, moving between different positions of concealment whenever patrol cars passed nearby. "He is definitely tracking our movements," Martinez radioed. "This guy knows what he is doing. He is staying just far enough away to avoid direct contact, but close enough to maintain surveillance on the victim's location." I coordinated with Rebecca to move her to a more secure location where officers could safely make contact without alerting the suspect to her exact position. The plan required her to move carefully through a series of connected buildings and parking structures while officers positioned themselves to intercept the pursuer when he attempted to follow. The operation became more complex when Rebecca reported that the suspect had begun using what appeared to be a two-way radio or communication device, speaking quietly into the device while continuing his surveillance activities. This raised the possibility that he was not working alone and might be coordinating with additional individuals who are not visible to either Rebecca or the responding officers. "I can hear him talking to someone," she whispered. "He keeps saying things like, 'She moved to the north side,' and 'The police are covering the main streets.' It sounds like he is getting instructions from someone else." This information prompted Sergeant Williams to request backup from multiple units and to implement a coordinated response strategy designed to address the possibility of multiple suspects operating in the area. Detective units were dispatched to monitor radio frequencies and attempt to identify any communications that might be related to the stalking incident. The breakthrough came when Officer Thompson observed the suspect's behavioral pattern and realized that he was following a predetermined route through downtown Anchorage, moving between specific locations in a sequence that suggested extensive prior reconnaissance. The suspect was not simply following Rebecca randomly, but was implementing a systematic hunting strategy that had probably been planned well in advance. "This looks like the Robert Hansen method," Detective Rodriguez observed after reviewing the situation. Hansen used to study his victims' routines for weeks before abducting them, learning their schedules and preferred routes so he could predict their movements and control the encounter. Hansen had been Alaska's most notorious serial killer, operating in the Anchorage area during the 1970s and early 1980s. He abducted women from downtown locations, transported them to remote areas, and hunted them like animals. His methods included extensive surveillance and preparation, allowing him to intercept victims at predictable locations and times. The parallel between Rebecca's situation and Hansen's historical methods prompted law enforcement to treat the incident as a potential kidnapping attempt rather than simple stalking. Additional resources were deployed, including K-9 units and specialized tactical officers trained in hostage rescue operations. The final phase of the incident occurred when the suspect realized that police presence was increasing and attempted to close the distance between himself and Rebecca before his escape routes were completely blocked. Officer Martinez observed him moving rapidly toward the office building where she was hiding, carrying what appeared to be restraints or binding materials in addition to his previous equipment. "He's making his move," Martinez radioed. "Suspect is approaching the victim's location with what looks like rope or zip ties. We need to intercept immediately." I maintained contact with Rebecca throughout the arrest operation, providing real-time updates and instructions to help her stay safe while officers moved into position. The suspect was taken into custody without incident as he attempted to enter the office building, found in possession of restraints, a hunting knife, detailed maps of downtown Anchorage, and photographs of Rebecca that had obviously been taken during previous surveillance sessions. Investigation revealed that David Kowalski, age 34, had been stalking Rebecca for over 3 months, documenting her work schedule, daily routines, and preferred routes through downtown Anchorage. He had been planning to abduct her using methods similar to those employed by Robert Hansen, including transportation to a remote cabin where he intended to hold her captive. Kowalski had studied Hansen's crimes extensively and had attempted to replicate the serial killer's techniques, but adapted for the modern era with updated surveillance technology and communication methods. He had been using multiple accomplices to monitor police radio frequencies and track law enforcement response patterns, allowing him to adjust his plans based on real-time information about emergency services activity. The investigation also revealed that Rebecca was not Kowalski's first intended victim. Evidence found in his residence showed that he had been conducting similar surveillance on at least 4 other women in the Anchorage area, all of whom worked evening shifts and walked alone through downtown areas during dark winter months. Kowalski was charged with stalking, attempted kidnapping, and conspiracy to commit murder. He was convicted on all charges and sentenced to 35 years in prison without possibility of parole. The case led to improved coordination between 911 dispatch services and patrol units during stalking incidents, and new protocols for identifying predatory behavior patterns in urban environments. Rebecca relocated to the lower 48 states after the incident and has remained in contact with our department to provide updates about her recovery and to assist with training programs designed to help other women recognize and respond to stalking situations. Every winter, when the darkness returns to Anchorage, I remember that 12-hour shift when we hunted a human predator through the frozen streets of downtown Alaska. The polar night creates opportunities for evil that exist nowhere else, and sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who study the methods of those who came before them. My name is Indiana, and I am a 35-year-old bush pilot operating out of Fairbanks, Alaska. What I experienced during a routine supply run to the remote village of Utqiagvik in January 2019 changed everything I thought I knew about human nature and the darkness that can consume isolated communities during the endless Arctic winter. The events I witnessed during that blood moon eclipse will haunt me for the rest of my life, and the official reports filed with the Federal Aviation Administration only tell a fraction of the true story. I had been flying supply runs to remote Alaskan villages for 12 years when this incident occurred, transporting everything from medical supplies to food staples to communities that were completely cut off from road systems and dependent on air transport for survival. Utqiagvik, located approximately 100 miles northeast of Fairbanks along the Black River, was one of my regular destinations. A village of fewer than 100 residents who live traditional subsistence lifestyles supplemented by seasonal work and government assistance programs. The January 2019 supply run was scheduled to coincide with a total lunar eclipse that would occur during the early morning hours of January 21st. The eclipse would be visible throughout Alaska, creating what astronomers call a blood moon, due to the reddish color that appears when Earth's shadow blocks direct sunlight from reaching the lunar surface. I had planned to arrive in Utqiagvik the evening before the eclipse to deliver medical supplies and food staples, then remain overnight to witness the astronomical event before returning to Fairbanks the following afternoon. My Cessna 180 was loaded with standard supplies, including prescription medications for several elderly residents, canned food items, batteries, and heating fuel. The flight from Fairbanks took approximately 90 minutes under normal winter conditions, following established VFR routes through the Yukon Flats National Wildlife Refuge. Weather conditions were typical for January with clear skies, temperatures around 30 degrees below zero, and light winds that would not interfere with landing operations. When I arrived at the Utqiagvik airstrip around 6 p.m. on January 20th, I immediately noticed that something was wrong with the village. Normally, my arrivals were met by several residents who helped unload supplies and provided updates about community needs and weather conditions. On this evening, however, the airstrip was completely deserted despite the fact that my arrival had been scheduled and confirmed through radio communication the previous day. The village appeared to be occupied, with smoke rising from several chimneys and lights visible in multiple buildings, but there was no sign of human activity anywhere within my field of vision. I completed my standard post-flight inspection and secured the aircraft, then began unloading supplies while waiting for someone from the village to make contact. After 30 minutes with no sign of residents, I decided to walk to the village office to determine what was happening and to ensure that the medical supplies reached the individuals who needed them. The temperature was dropping rapidly as darkness approached, and I was concerned that some of the medications might be damaged by extended exposure to extreme cold. The walk from the airstrip to the village center took approximately 10 minutes, following a well-maintained trail that was marked with reflectors for winter travel. As I approached the first residential buildings, I began to hear sounds that were not consistent with normal village activities. Low humming or chanting seemed to be coming from multiple locations, accompanied by rhythmic drumming that reminded me of traditional ceremonies I had witnessed in other native Alaskan communities. But there was something disturbing about these sounds that made me increasingly uncomfortable as I moved closer to their source. The chanting had an urgent, almost frantic quality, and the drumming was faster and more intense than anything I had experienced during cultural events or religious ceremonies. When I reached the village community center, where most public meetings and ceremonies typically took place, I discovered that all of the residents appeared to be gathered inside the building. Warm light was visible through the windows, and the sounds of chanting and drumming were much louder and more distinct. I knocked on the door and called out my name, identifying myself as the pilot who had delivered their supplies. The response from inside was immediate and disturbing. All sounds stopped completely, followed by several minutes of absolute silence. Then I heard footsteps approaching the door, and it opened to reveal Martha Peter, the village council secretary whom I had known for several years through my regular supply runs. But Martha's appearance was shocking and frightening in ways that I struggled to comprehend. Her normally neat clothing was stained with what appeared to be dried blood, and her hands and face were similarly marked with dark red stains. Her eyes appeared bloodshot and unusually bright, and when she smiled at me, I could see that her teeth were also stained with blood. "Indiana," she said, her voice sounding hoarse and strained. "We have been waiting for you. Please come inside and join our ceremony." I asked her what type of ceremony was taking place and whether medical attention was needed for anyone in the village. Her response made no sense and filled me with a growing sense of dread about the situation I had walked into. "The blood moon requires blood offerings," she said. "The old spirits demand tribute when the moon turns red. We have been preparing all day, and now we need fresh blood to complete the ritual." This explanation was completely contrary to everything I knew about traditional Gwich'in cultural practices and spiritual beliefs. The residents of Utqiagvik were predominantly Gwich'in Athabascans who maintained strong connections to their traditional culture, but their spiritual practices were typically focused on respect for the land and animals, not blood sacrifice or ritualistic consumption. I told Martha that I needed to return to my aircraft to secure additional equipment, but that I would return shortly to participate in their ceremony. My actual intention was to contact the Alaska State Troopers via emergency radio to report the situation and request assistance for what appeared to be a serious medical or psychological crisis affecting the entire village. As I backed away from the community center, I could see faces peering at me through the windows. Every person I could observe showed the same disturbing characteristics that Martha had displayed: blood-stained clothing and faces, unnaturally bright eyes, and behavior that seemed agitated and predatory. When I reached my aircraft, I immediately activated my emergency radio and attempted to contact flight services in Fairbanks to report the situation. However, atmospheric conditions associated with the approaching lunar eclipse were creating significant radio interference, making clear communication extremely difficult. I was able to transmit basic information about my location and the fact that I needed emergency assistance, but I could not provide detailed information about what I had observed in the village. The radio operator advised me that weather conditions would make helicopter response impossible until the following day, but that Alaska State Troopers would attempt to reach my location by snowmobile if road conditions permitted. While waiting for emergency response, I observed the village from a distance using binoculars, trying to understand what was happening and whether there was anything I could do to help the residents. What I witnessed during the next several hours convinced me that I was dealing with something far beyond normal psychological crisis or medical emergency. As the lunar eclipse began around midnight, The residents of Utqiagvik emerged from the community center and began moving through the village in organized groups. They appeared to be conducting some type of ritualistic activity that involved visiting each residential building in a specific sequence, spending 15 to 20 minutes at each location before moving to the next. Through my binoculars, I could see that they were carrying containers that appeared to hold liquid, and that they were applying this liquid to themselves and to the buildings they visited. The substance looked dark and viscous, consistent with blood, and their behavior while handling it was reverent and ceremonial. Most disturbing was the realization that the ritual appeared to involve the consumption of whatever substance they were carrying. I observed multiple individuals drinking from the containers and sharing them with other participants, all while the lunar eclipse created an eerie red glow across the snow-covered landscape. The eclipse reached totality around 1:30 a.m., at which point the village activities became more frenzied and chaotic. The residents began running between buildings, calling to each other in voices that sounded more animal than human, and engaging in behavior that appeared increasingly violent and uncontrolled. I witnessed several physical altercations between village members that seemed to involve biting and clawing rather than normal fighting techniques. The participants appeared to be attempting to draw blood from each other, and those who succeeded in doing so would immediately consume whatever blood they obtained. By 3 a.m., when the eclipse was ending and normal moonlight was returning, the village activities began to subside. The residents gradually returned to their homes, moving slowly and appearing exhausted or disoriented. By sunrise, the village appeared completely normal again, with smoke rising from chimneys and no visible signs of the previous night's disturbing activities. The Alaska State Troopers arrived by snowmobile around noon the following day, accompanied by a medical team from Fairbanks. When we approached the village together, the residents appeared completely normal and claimed no memory of the previous night's events. Martha Peter, who had appeared so disturbing the night before, greeted us with her usual professional demeanor and seemed genuinely confused when I described what I had observed. She acknowledged that the village had held a ceremony to observe the lunar eclipse, but described it as a traditional blessing ritual that involved sharing food and offering prayers. Medical examinations revealed that several residents were suffering from severe vitamin D deficiency and related nutritional problems that can cause psychological disturbances and behavioral changes. The isolation of Utqiagvik during winter months, combined with extremely limited sunlight and dietary restrictions, had created conditions that could trigger desperate cravings for specific nutrients found in fresh blood. The investigation determined that the residents had been supplementing their winter diet with blood from hunting kills, a practice that was not unusual in remote Alaskan communities, but that had apparently escalated during the prolonged darkness and lunar eclipse into ritualistic behavior that mimicked vampiric feeding. All affected residents received nutritional supplements and psychological counseling, and the village council implemented new dietary protocols to prevent similar incidents during future winter months. The official report classified the incident as a mass psychological episode triggered by nutritional deficiency and seasonal affective disorder. But I know what I witnessed during that blood moon eclipse was something far more disturbing than simple malnutrition or psychological crisis. The coordinated nature of the activities, the apparent consumption of blood, and the complete transformation of an entire community into something predatory and inhuman suggests that there are aspects of human nature that emerge only under the most extreme conditions. I have continued flying supply runs to remote Alaskan villages, but I now refuse assignments that coincide with lunar eclipses or other astronomical events that might trigger similar episodes. The darkness of the Arctic winter can transform good people into something unrecognizable, and some transformations should never be witnessed by the living. My name is Dalen, and I am a 28-year-old pipeline maintenance worker for the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System. What I experienced during a routine inspection assignment along the remote Prudhoe Bay section in February 2022 challenged everything I thought I knew about the boundary between the living and the dead in Alaska's frozen wilderness. The voices that called to me from the endless white expanse nearly cost me my life, and the official incident report filed with Alyeska Pipeline Service Company only documents a fraction of what actually occurred during those 72 hours of polar night terror. I had been working pipeline maintenance for 6 years when this assignment came through, specializing in electronic monitoring systems and emergency shutdown procedures along the 800-mile pipeline route that carries crude oil from Prudhoe Bay to the port of Valdez. February maintenance work required extreme cold weather protocols due to temperatures that regularly dropped below 40 degrees Fahrenheit and weather conditions that could change from clear to life-threatening in minutes. The assignment was routine inspection and calibration of remote terminal units located at stations 47 through 52, a stretch of approximately 30 miles through some of the most isolated terrain in North America. The area sits within the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge boundaries, hundreds of miles from the nearest permanent settlement, and accessible only by specialized Arctic vehicles or helicopter transport during favorable weather conditions. My supervisor, Jim Kowalski, had originally planned to send a 2-person crew for this assignment, but budget constraints and scheduling conflicts meant that I would be working alone for the estimated 3-day duration. Standard protocol required daily check-ins via satellite radio and emergency beacon activation if communication was not established within 12-hour periods. I departed from Dead Horse Camp on February 14th using a specialized Arctic Cat tracked vehicle equipped with survival gear, communication equipment, and sufficient heating fuel for extended operation in extreme temperatures. The route followed established pipeline service roads, but winter conditions meant that sections of the path were often obscured by snowdrifts and required careful navigation using GPS coordinates. The first station inspection proceeded normally, with all electronic systems functioning within acceptable parameters and no mechanical issues requiring immediate attention. Station 48, located approximately 8 miles further south, also showed normal operation status when I arrived there around 2 in the afternoon. It was while I was working on calibration procedures at Station 49 that I first began hearing the voices. Initially, I attributed the sounds to wind effects created by the pipeline infrastructure, which can generate unusual acoustics, phenomena when combined with specific atmospheric conditions. High-pressure gas flowing through large diameter pipes creates vibrations that can be transmitted through the ground and metallic structures, sometimes producing sounds that resemble human speech or music. But the voices I was hearing were too distinct and consistent to be explained by mechanical resonance or atmospheric effects. They seemed to be calling my name specifically, coming from different directions around the station site, sometimes close enough that I expected to see another person when I turned to look for the source. The voices were speaking in English, but with accents and speech patterns that reminded me of historical recordings I had heard of early 20th century gold prospectors and trappers. They were calling for help, describing being lost in blizzards, trapped by ice, or injured and unable to reach safety. The desperation and fear in these voices was completely convincing, and my first instinct was to respond by searching for whoever was calling for assistance. I spent nearly 2 hours walking in expanding circles around Station 49, following the voices and attempting to locate anyone who might be in distress. The temperature was approaching 45 degrees below zero, with wind conditions that made extended exposure extremely dangerous, but the urgency in the voices compelled me to continue searching despite the risk to my own safety. During my search, I discovered physical evidence that suggested the area had been used by travelers in the past. Partially buried under snow and ice, I found remnants of what appeared to be a campsite including rusted metal objects, fragments of canvas or leather, and pieces of wood that had been shaped by tools rather than natural weathering processes. Most disturbing was the discovery of human remains scattered across an area approximately 100 yards from the pipeline station. The bones were old and weathered, clearly having been exposed to the elements for many years, but they were arranged in patterns that suggested the individuals had died during severe weather conditions while attempting to travel across the tundra. Personal effects found among the remains included a pocket watch dated 1923, brass buttons from heavy winter clothing, and a leather pouch containing what appeared to be gold nuggets and mining equipment. These items suggested that the deceased individuals had been prospectors or miners who had become lost during Alaska's early development period, probably during winter travel when navigation was extremely difficult and survival depended on finding shelter quickly. As darkness fell and temperatures continued dropping, I decided to return to my vehicle and establish communication with headquarters before continuing my investigation. The voices had become more frequent and urgent during my search, but they were now coming from directions that led away from any shelter or safety, calling me deeper into the wilderness where survival would be impossible. When I attempted to start my Arctic Cat, the engine would not turn over despite the fact that all pre-trip inspections had been completed successfully and the vehicle had been functioning normally throughout the day. Emergency protocols required me to activate my distress beacon and remain with the vehicle until rescue teams could reach my location, but the voices calling from the tundra were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The sounds were no longer simply calling for help, but were describing specific directions and landmarks that would supposedly lead to warmth, shelter, and safety. They spoke of cabins hidden in the landscape, abandoned mining camps with supplies and heating fuel, and routes that would take me to populated areas where I could find assistance. Everything about these descriptions contradicted my knowledge of the local geography and the realities of Arctic survival, but the voices were so compelling and realistic that I found myself seriously considering leaving the safety of my vehicle to follow their guidance. The cold was becoming increasingly uncomfortable despite my specialized clothing and the vehicle's heating system, and the idea of finding actual shelter was appealing. It was only when I consulted my GPS unit and topographic maps that I realized the locations being described by the voices corresponded to areas that were dozens of miles from any established trails or known structures. Following these directions would mean abandoning my vehicle and emergency equipment to walk across open tundra in life-threatening weather conditions with no realistic possibility of finding shelter or assistance. I activated my emergency beacon and established radio contact with headquarters to report my vehicle breakdown and request immediate rescue. The duty officer informed me that weather conditions would prevent helicopter response until the following morning, but that a ground-based rescue team would attempt to reach my location using specialized Arctic vehicles. Throughout the night, the voices continued calling from various directions around my position, sometimes close enough that I expected to see faces pressed against the vehicle windows. The sounds were accompanied by other phenomena that I struggled to explain rationally. Tapping on the vehicle's exterior panels, footsteps in the snow around the perimeter, and shadows moving past the windows despite the complete darkness of the polar night. Around 3 in the morning, during a period when the voices had become particularly urgent and insistent, I made the decision to leave my vehicle and investigate the source of the sounds. The rational part of my mind recognized that this was extremely dangerous and contradicted all emergency protocols, but the desperation and authenticity of the voices made ignoring them seem inhuman. I equipped myself with a flashlight, emergency supplies, and GPS unit, then followed the most persistent voice approximately 200 yards north of the pipeline station. The voice was describing a route to an abandoned mining cabin where I could find shelter and warmth while waiting for rescue, providing detailed directions about landmarks and distance markers. When I reached the location where the cabin was supposed to be situated, I found only empty tundra covered with snow and ice. There was no evidence of any structure having existed in the area, and my GPS unit showed that I was now nearly half a mile from my vehicle and emergency equipment. The realization that I had been lured away from safety by non-existent voices created an immediate crisis situation. The temperature was life-threatening. I was far from shelter, and my emergency beacon was back at the vehicle. More critically, the voices had stopped completely, leaving me alone in the absolute darkness and silence of the Arctic wilderness. I attempted to retrace my route back to the vehicle using GPS coordinates, but the combination of extreme cold, darkness, and the psychological stress of the situation made navigation extremely difficult. My flashlight began failing due to battery drain caused by the low temperature, and hypothermia was beginning to affect my coordination and decision-making abilities. The rescue team located me approximately 6 hours later, suffering from moderate hypothermia and frostbite on my fingers and toes. I was found nearly 1 mile from my vehicle, walking in circles and calling out responses to voices that the rescue personnel could not hear. Medical treatment at the Dead Horse Medical Facility determined that I had been experiencing auditory hallucinations caused by a combination of extreme cold, isolation, and carbon monoxide poisoning from my vehicle's heating system. However, subsequent investigation of the area where I heard the voices revealed additional human remains that corresponded to the personal effects I had discovered during my initial search. Archaeological analysis determined that at least 12 individuals had died in the immediate area during the early 1900s, probably gold prospectors who became lost during winter travel and froze to death while attempting to find shelter. The official investigation concluded that carbon monoxide from my vehicle's faulty heating system had caused hallucinations that incorporated my subconscious awareness of the historical tragedy that had occurred at the location. The voices I heard were psychological manifestations of my knowledge about the dangers of winter travel in Arctic conditions, combined with the effects of mild poisoning and extreme environmental stress. But I know that the voices I heard were not hallucinations or the products of carbon monoxide poisoning. They were the desperate calls of men who died alone in the wilderness nearly a century ago, still trying to find someone who would help them reach safety. The Arctic tundra holds the spirits of everyone who has died there, and during the polar night, when darkness covers the land for months at a time, those spirits continue calling for assistance that never comes. I transferred to pipeline maintenance work in warmer climates after completing my medical recovery, but every winter, when the news reports Alaska's temperatures and weather conditions, I remember those voices calling from the frozen wasteland. Some places hold on to the dead, and the Trans-Alaska Pipeline crosses hundreds of miles of terrain where travelers have perished alone and afraid, their voices still echoing across the tundra for anyone willing to listen. My name is Talon, and I am a 33-year-old Alaska State Trooper stationed out of Nome, Alaska. What I experienced during a missing persons investigation along the Iditarod Trail in March 2021 revealed one of the most disturbing serial murder cases in Alaska's modern history. The evidence we uncovered in the frozen wilderness challenged everything I thought I knew about human evil, and the lengths predators will go to exploit Alaska's remote geography for their twisted purposes. The case files remain partially sealed due to ongoing appeals, but the memories of what we found buried beneath decades of permafrost will stay with me until my dying day. I had been working as a state trooper for 9 years when this case began, specializing in rural crime, investigation, and search and rescue operations across western Alaska. Nome serves as the headquarters for law enforcement, covering over 50,000 square miles of some of the most remote and challenging terrain in North America, including dozens of villages accessible only by airplane or snowmobile during winter months. The investigation began with what appeared to be routine missing persons reports filed during the 2021 Iditarod Trail Sled Dog Race. 3 mooshers participating in recreational races that follow portions of the famous trail had failed to reach their designated checkpoints within expected timeframes. Initially, race officials assumed the delays were caused by harsh weather conditions or mechanical problems with sleds and equipment, common occurrences during Alaska's extreme winter racing season. The first missing moosher was Jennifer Kozlowski, a 34-year-old teacher from Fairbanks, who was participating in her first long-distance race as preparation for attempting the full Iditarod the following year. She had been scheduled to reach the Koyuk checkpoint on March 8th, but never arrived. Her emergency beacon had stopped transmitting approximately 40 miles east of Nome, in an area known for difficult terrain and unpredictable weather conditions. Michael Chen, age 29, disappeared 2 days later along a different section of trail approximately 60 miles northeast of Nome. His sled dogs were found wandering loose near an abandoned mining camp, but there was no sign of Chen or his racing sled. The dogs appeared well fed and showed no signs of distress, suggesting that whatever had happened to their musher had occurred recently. The third disappearance created immediate alarm among race officials and law enforcement. Sarah Nakamura, a 42-year-old veterinarian from Anchorage, vanished from a section of trail that was considered relatively safe and well-traveled. Her emergency GPS unit showed that she had stopped moving near a known camping area used by recreational mushers, but search teams found no evidence of her presence at that location. As the lead investigator assigned to coordinate search efforts, I immediately recognized patterns that suggested these were not isolated incidents caused by weather or equipment failure. The locations where the mushers disappeared were all within a 60-mile radius of Nome, along trail sections that passed through areas with limited visibility and multiple alternative routes that could be used to transport people or evidence without detection. Search and rescue operations deployed helicopter teams, snowmobile patrols, and volunteer searchers to cover the areas where emergency beacons had last transmitted signals. The terrain consisted of rolling tundra broken by creek beds, abandoned mining operations, and scattered stands of willow and alder brush that provided concealment for anyone attempting to avoid detection. During the third day of aerial search operations, pilot Danny Kowalski reported observing unusual activity near an abandoned gold mining operation approximately 45 miles east of Nome. Through binoculars, he had observed what appeared to be freshly disturbed snow and sled tracks leading toward a cluster of deteriorated buildings that had not been used commercially for several decades. When ground teams reached the mining site, we discovered evidence that someone had been using the abandoned facilities for extended periods during recent winter months. Multiple buildings showed signs of recent occupancy, including sleeping areas, food storage, and heating equipment that had been installed without any permits or legal authorization. More disturbing was the discovery of personal items that belonged to the missing mushers scattered throughout the main building. Jennifer Kozlowski's racing bib was found nailed to a wall alongside photographs that appeared to have been taken during previous Iditarod races. Michael Chen's emergency GPS unit was found dismantled in a workshop area, and Sarah Nakamura's veterinary medical kit was discovered in what appeared to be a makeshift laboratory setup. The building that had been converted into living quarters contained journals and notebooks documenting detailed surveillance of musher activities along various sections of the Iditarod Trail. The entries, written in neat handwriting, described the routes, schedules, and equipment used by dozens of individual mushers over multiple racing seasons. The level of detail suggested that whoever had created these records had been conducting systematic observation for several years. Most chilling were entries that described specific plans for intercepting mushers at remote locations along the trail, including detailed maps showing ambush sites, escape routes, and locations suitable for disposing of evidence. The journals made references to Robert Hansen's methods of hunting human beings, but adapted specifically for the geography and conditions of the Iditarod Trail system. Evidence analysis revealed that the abandoned mining camp had been used as a base of operations for someone who had been targeting recreational mushers for at least 5 years. Forensic examination of the buildings uncovered human remains buried beneath the permafrost layer in multiple locations around the property. The bodies were preserved by the extreme cold, allowing us to identify victims and determine causes of death. The investigation expanded when we realized that the missing mushers were not the first victims. Dental records and personal effects found at the site allowed us to identify 7 additional individuals who had disappeared along various sections of the Iditarod Trail between 2016 and 2020. All victims were recreational mushers who had been traveling alone through remote sections of trail during winter months when visibility was limited and rescue operations were extremely difficult. The perpetrator had developed a systematic method for identifying and targeting vulnerable mushers using detailed surveillance and knowledge of trail conditions. He monitored radio communications between race checkpoints to track individual mushers' progress and identify those who were traveling alone or behind schedule. Emergency GPS beacons were intercepted and disabled to prevent rescue teams from locating victims quickly. The killer used sled dogs and racing equipment to approach victims without arousing suspicion, appearing to be another musher who might offer assistance with mechanical problems or navigation. Once he gained access to victims, he used restraints and weapons to control them before transporting them to the abandoned mining camp, where they were held captive and eventually murdered. DNA evidence collected from the crime scenes matched samples in the national database to Thomas Utqiagvik, age 46, a former competitive musher who had been banned from official Iditarod competition in 2014 due to animal abuse violations. Utqiagvik had extensive knowledge of the trail system and owned sufficient equipment to travel undetected through remote areas during winter months. The investigation revealed that Utqiagvik had been inspired by Robert Hansen's methods, but had adapted them specifically for Alaska's modern recreational mushing community. Like Hansen, who used his skills as a pilot and hunter to abduct and kill women in remote areas, Utqiagvik exploited his expertise with sled dogs and winter survival to hunt human beings along the Iditarod Trail. Utqiagvik had studied Hansen's crimes extensively and had applied similar psychological techniques, including extended periods of captivity, during which victims were tortured and terrorized before being killed. The abandoned mining camp provided the isolated location necessary for these activities, and the extreme winter conditions ensured that evidence would be preserved until spring weather made investigation possible. The manhunt for Utqiagvik required coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies and specialized tactical units trained for operations in extreme weather conditions. His knowledge of the terrain and access to winter transportation equipment made him extremely dangerous to pursue, and there was concern that he might target additional mushers while evading capture. The breakthrough came when we discovered that Utqiagvik had been monitoring law enforcement radio communications and was aware of our investigation. Rather than attempting to flee Alaska, he had decided to continue his killing spree, apparently believing that he could evade capture indefinitely by staying mobile along the vast network of winter trails that crisscross western Alaska. Utqiagvik was located and apprehended during a coordinated operation that used decoy mushers to lure him into an ambush near the Kodiak checkpoint. Tactical officers disguised as recreational mushers had been positioned along multiple sections of trail based on intelligence about his movement patterns and preferred hunting locations. When Utqiagvik approached what he believed was a vulnerable target, specialized arrest teams surrounded him using snowmobiles and winter camouflage equipment. He was found in possession of restraints, weapons, and detailed surveillance notes about mushers who were participating in races scheduled for later in the season. During interrogation, Utqiagvik confessed to the murders of 12 mushers over a 5-year period, describing his methods in detail and expressing pride in his ability to hunt human beings more effectively than Robert Hansen had managed decades earlier. He claimed that the Iditarod Trail provided perfect hunting conditions because victims were isolated, predictable in their movements, and unlikely to be missed quickly when they disappeared. Utqiagvik was charged with 12 counts of first-degree murder and received multiple life sentences without possibility of parole. The case led to enhanced safety protocols for recreational mushing events and improved communication systems for tracking participants during long-distance races. The investigation also revealed that Utqiagvik had been planning to expand his activities to include the Yukon Quest and other long-distance mushing events throughout Alaska and Canada. Evidence found at the mining camp showed that he had been conducting surveillance along multiple trail systems and had identified dozens of potential victims for future hunting expeditions. The discovery of the mining camp crime scene required specialized excavation equipment to recover human remains from the permafrost, a process that took several months and involved forensic teams from multiple agencies. The extreme cold had preserved evidence that would have been destroyed in warmer climates, allowing investigators to reconstruct the timeline of murders and understand the full scope of Utqiagvik's activities. Family members of victims traveled to Nome from across the United States to attend court proceedings and memorial services for their loved ones. Many expressed gratitude that the killer had been apprehended, but also anger that someone had been able to exploit Alaska's remote geography to commit serial murders for such an extended period without detection. The case highlighted the unique challenges of law enforcement in Alaska, where vast distances, extreme weather conditions, and limited communication infrastructure create opportunities for predators to operate undetected. The Iditarod Trail covers over 1,000 miles of wilderness, making comprehensive surveillance and protection of participants extremely difficult during winter months. Enhanced safety measures implemented after the investigation include mandatory GPS tracking for all recreational mushers, improved communication protocols between checkpoints, and increased law enforcement patrols along remote sections of trail during racing seasons. These changes have made it more difficult for predators to target mushers, but the vastness of Alaska's wilderness continues to present challenges for ensuring participant safety. Every winter, when the Iditarod race begins and mushers head out across Alaska's frozen wilderness, I remember the victims we found buried beneath the permafrost at that abandoned mining camp. The trail that represents adventure and achievement for thousands of people had become a hunting ground for a human predator who understood that Alaska's remote geography could hide unspeakable crimes for years before anyone discovered the truth. The investigation taught me that some of Alaska's most dangerous predators are not bears or wolves, but human beings who exploit the state's isolation and harsh conditions to satisfy their twisted desires. Thomas Utqiagvik will spend the rest of his life in prison, but the wilderness he used as his hunting ground remains as vast and remote as ever, still capable of hiding secrets beneath its frozen surface. My name is Dion, and I am a 27-year-old wilderness guide operating out of Fairbanks, Alaska. What I experienced during a November 2020 hunting expedition in the Brooks Range challenged everything I thought I knew about human psychology and the depths of primal hunger that can emerge during extreme isolation. The client I was guiding through Alaska's most remote wilderness developed symptoms that defied medical explanation, and the decisions I made during those 10 days of polar darkness saved both our lives while revealing the terrifying truth about what starvation can do to the human mind and body. I had been working as a professional hunting guide for 8 years when this assignment came through my outfitter service, specializing in remote backcountry expeditions for clients who wanted to experience Alaska's wilderness far from established hunting lodges and commercial operations. The Brooks Range, located north of the Arctic Circle, provided some of the most challenging and rewarding hunting opportunities in North America, but also required extensive survival skills and emergency preparedness due to extreme weather conditions and complete isolation from any rescue services. The client was Marcus Weber, a 43-year-old investment banker from Chicago who had been planning this expedition for over 2 years. Weber was an experienced hunter who had traveled to Africa, New Zealand, and other international destinations, but this would be his first time hunting in Alaska's Arctic wilderness during the onset of polar night. He had specifically requested a November expedition because he wanted to experience the challenge of hunting caribou and potentially wolves during the most difficult time of year. Our planned itinerary included 10 days of backcountry hunting, starting from a remote airstrip approximately 150 miles north of Fairbanks, and covering territory that stretched deep into the Brooks Range, where few hunters ever venture. The area was known for excellent caribou populations and occasional wolf sightings, but it also presented significant risks due to rapidly changing weather conditions and the complete absence of any communication or rescue infrastructure. Weber arrived in Fairbanks on November 8th, and we spent 2 days reviewing safety protocols, testing equipment, and confirming our hunting objectives. He appeared to be in excellent physical condition and demonstrated familiarity with the specialized cold weather gear required for Arctic hunting. His rifle was a high-quality .300 Winchester Magnum that he had used successfully on previous hunting trips, and he carried sufficient ammunition for extended hunting activities. We were transported to the remote airstrip by bush pilot Larry Kowalski, who would return to collect us on November 18th, assuming weather conditions permitted. The flight took nearly 3 hours through increasingly desolate terrain, and by the time we reached our starting location, we were surrounded by endless white wilderness with no visible signs of human presence in any direction. The first 3 days of hunting proceeded normally, with Weber demonstrating competent backcountry skills and appropriate enthusiasm for the challenging conditions. We covered approximately 15 miles per day, following caribou migration routes and setting up camp at locations that provided shelter from wind and access to water sources. Weber successfully harvested a bull caribou on our 3rd day, and we spent several hours processing the meat and preparing it for transport. It was during our 4th day that I first began noticing changes in Weber's behavior and physical condition. He had been eating normally during our first few days, consuming the high-calorie meals we had brought, and showing appropriate appetite for the energy demands of Arctic hunting. However, on November 12th, he began refusing most food items and complained of nausea and stomach problems that made eating difficult. Initially, I attributed these symptoms to altitude sickness or stress reactions to the extreme cold and isolation. Many clients from urban backgrounds experience digestive problems when adapting to backcountry conditions, and Weber's symptoms seemed consistent with normal adjustment difficulties. I provided him with over-the-counter medications and encouraged him to maintain caloric intake despite his discomfort. But Weber's condition continued to deteriorate over the following 2 days, and his behavior began changing in ways that concerned me beyond simple physical illness. He became increasingly agitated and restless, pacing around our campsite for hours during the night and showing signs of insomnia that were affecting his judgment and coordination during hunting activities. More disturbing was his developing obsession with the raw meat from the caribou he had harvested. While we had been cooking portions of the meat for meals, Weber began requesting increasingly rare preparations and eventually began consuming completely raw meat despite my warnings about food safety and the risk of parasitic infections common in wild game. His consumption of raw meat became compulsive and excessive, far beyond what was necessary for nutritional requirements. I observed him eating large quantities of raw caribou during the night, tearing at the meat with his hands and consuming it with an urgency that seemed driven by desperation rather than normal hunger. Weber's physical appearance also began changing in ways that alarmed me as a guide responsible for client safety. His skin became pale and appeared almost translucent in certain lighting conditions, and dark circles developed under his eyes that made him look gaunt and unhealthy. His fingernails seemed to be growing more rapidly than normal, becoming yellowed and claw-like in appearance. Most concerning was the change in his eyes, which seemed to have developed any unusual sensitivity to light and appeared to have taken on a reddish tint that was particularly noticeable during the brief twilight periods we experienced each day. When he looked at me directly, there was something predatory and unsettling in his expression that made me increasingly uncomfortable about being alone with him in the wilderness. On our 7th day in the Brooks Range, Weber's behavior escalated to a level that made me fear for my safety. I had been awakened around 3 in the morning by sounds coming from where we had hung our meat storage, and when I investigated with a flashlight, I found Weber feeding on the raw caribou with an animalistic intensity that was unlike anything I had ever witnessed. He was crouched beside the hanging meat, tearing pieces free with his hands and teeth, and consuming them with sounds that were more growling than human. When my flashlight beam illuminated him, he looked up at me with an expression of territorial aggression, baring his teeth, which appeared to be stained with blood, and displaying behavior that was more animal than human. I attempted to approach him calmly and encourage him to return to the tent, but Weber responded by making threatening gestures and continuing to feed on the raw meat. His movements were quick and erratic, and I realized that he was no longer responding to verbal communication in a normal manner. The situation became more dangerous when Weber began showing interest in the blood that had dripped from the hanging meat onto the snow below our cache. He was consuming this blood-soaked snow with obvious satisfaction, and when I attempted to intervene, he became aggressive and protective of his feeding site. I made the decision to activate my emergency satellite beacon and request immediate evacuation. Despite the fact that we were still 3 days from our scheduled pickup, Weber's condition was clearly beyond anything I could manage as a hunting guide, and I was concerned that his behavior might escalate to violence if his psychological state continued deteriorating. The emergency response team informed me that weather conditions would prevent helicopter evacuation for at least 24 hours, but that they would dispatch a rescue team as soon as flight operations became possible. In the meantime, I was advised to maintain distance from Weber, while ensuring that he did not wander away from our campsite and become lost in the wilderness. Maintaining surveillance of Weber while protecting my own safety became increasingly difficult as his behavior continued to change throughout our 8th day. He spent most of the daylight hours crouched beside our meat storage, consuming raw caribou and showing little interest in any other activities. When I attempted to engage him in conversation, his responses were minimal and often incomprehensible. Most disturbing was Weber's apparent loss of normal human behavioral patterns. He no longer seemed interested in maintaining personal hygiene, temperature regulation, or other basic survival activities. His entire focus had shifted to consuming raw meat and blood, and he displayed territorial behavior around our food storage that suggested he viewed me as a potential threat to his feeding activities. During our 9th night in the wilderness, Weber's condition reached a crisis point that forced me to take defensive measures for my own protection. I had been sleeping in a separate shelter approximately 50 yards from our main camp, but I was awakened by sounds that suggested Weber was attempting to access my food supplies and personal equipment. When I investigated, I discovered that Weber had torn open my pack and was consuming raw energy bars, canned food, and even non-food items with the same desperate hunger he had shown toward the caribou meat. His behavior was completely irrational, and when he noticed my presence, he made aggressive movements toward me that forced me to retreat to a defensive position. I spent the remainder of the night maintaining watch over Weber, while staying far enough away to avoid confrontation. His behavior continued to be erratic and predatory, and I realized that whatever was affecting him had progressed beyond simple psychological breakdown to something that posed immediate physical danger. The rescue helicopter arrived on the morning of our 10th day, and the medical team immediately recognized that Weber was experiencing a severe medical emergency that required immediate evacuation to a hospital facility. He was sedated for transport due to his aggressive behavior and apparent inability to respond to normal communication. Medical examination at Fairbanks Memorial Hospital determined that Weber was suffering from severe protein deficiency and related nutritional imbalances that had triggered a psychological condition known as protein energy malnutrition psychosis. The extreme cold, physical stress, and inadequate caloric intake had created metabolic changes that resulted in desperate cravings for protein and fat, manifesting as compulsive consumption of raw meat and blood. The medical team explained that Weber's symptoms were similar to those documented in historical cases of Arctic exploration and survival situations, where individuals had been forced to consume raw meat and blood to survive extreme conditions. The psychological effects of these dietary changes, combined with isolation and stress, could trigger behavioral changes that resembled vampiric or cannibalistic tendencies. Weber received nutritional supplementation, psychological counseling, and medical treatment for several weeks before making a full recovery. He had no memory of his behavior during the final days of our hunting expedition and was horrified when informed about his actions. Medical evaluation determined that he had a pre-existing metabolic condition that made him particularly susceptible to nutritional deficiencies under extreme stress conditions. The incident led to enhanced medical screening requirements for clients booking backcountry hunting expeditions, and I now require all clients to undergo comprehensive physical examinations before participating in extended wilderness activities. The experience taught me that the human body can undergo dramatic changes under extreme conditions, and that starvation and isolation can trigger behavioral changes that transform civilized individuals into something unrecognizable. I continue working as a wilderness hunting guide, but I now carry specialized emergency medical supplies and maintain more frequent communication with medical support services during remote expeditions. The Brooks Range remains one of the most challenging and rewarding hunting destinations in the world, but the incident with Weber reminded me that Alaska's wilderness can reveal aspects of human nature that should remain hidden from civilization. My name is Kendricks, and I am a 30-year-old glaciologist with the University of Alaska Fairbanks Geophysical Institute. What I experienced during a winter research expedition on the Mendenhall Glacier in January 2022 challenged everything I thought I knew about the boundary between ancient history and the present day. The voices that emerged from the ice cores we extracted spoke of tragedies that occurred thousands of years ago, and the phenomena I documented during those 3 weeks of research revealed that some aspects of human suffering can be preserved in ice for millennia, waiting for the right conditions to be released back into the world. I had been studying glacial ice formations for 7 years when this research opportunity arose, specializing in paleoclimatic analysis and the extraction of environmental data from ice core samples. The Mendenhall Glacier, located approximately 12 miles from Juneau, Alaska, provided an excellent research site for studying climate change effects on glacial retreat and the historical environmental conditions preserved within layers of compacted ice and snow. Our research team consisted of 4 scientists tasked with extracting deep ice core samples during the optimal winter conditions, when glacier accessibility was safest and weather patterns were most predictable. The project was funded by the National Science Foundation as part of a broader study examining rapid glacial retreat in southeast Alaska and its implications for regional climate patterns. Dr. Sarah Martinez served as our expedition leader, bringing 15 years of experience in polar research and ice core analysis. James Peterson, our drill operations specialist, was responsible for the complex machinery required to extract ice cores from depths exceeding 200 feet below the glacier surface. Maria Santos, our laboratory technician, handled sample preservation and preliminary analysis procedures. I was assigned responsibility for geological mapping and core sample documentation. We established our research camp on the glacier surface on January 15th, using specialized Arctic shelters designed to withstand the extreme wind conditions and temperature fluctuations common in the area during winter months. Our equipment included ice core drilling apparatus, sample preservation systems, and laboratory facilities for conducting immediate analysis of extracted materials. The first week of research proceeded according to established protocols, with successful extraction of ice core samples representing approximately 3,000 years of accumulated glacial ice. The cores provided excellent data about historical temperature variations, atmospheric composition changes, and volcanic activity that had affected the region over multiple millennia. It was during our second week of operations that we began extracting ice cores from deeper glacial layers, reaching depths that contained ice formed during prehistoric periods when indigenous populations first inhabited southeast Alaska. The ice from these ancient layers appeared different from more recent formations, showing darker coloration and unusual crystal structures that suggested different environmental conditions during the time of formation. Dr. Martinez noted that the prehistoric ice cores contained significantly higher concentrations of organic materials than we had observed in more recent samples. Microscopic analysis revealed fragments of plant matter, ash particles from ancient fires, and what appeared to be microscopic bone fragments that suggested the presence of human activity in the area during the ice formation period. Most intriguing were ice core sections that contained what appeared to be preserved blood and tissue samples from animals and potentially humans who had lived in the region thousands of years ago. The preservation quality was remarkable, with cellular structures remaining intact due to the extreme cold and the absence of oxygen within the glacial ice. It was while we were conducting laboratory analysis of these prehistoric samples that I first began experiencing the auditory phenomena that would define the remainder of our expedition. During the evening of January 22nd, while examining ice core samples under laboratory conditions, I began hearing faint sounds that seemed to be coming from the ice itself. Initially, the sounds were subtle and could easily have been attributed to the normal settling and cracking noises that glacial ice produces as it responds to temperature changes and gravitational stress. However, as I continued working with the prehistoric ice samples, the sounds became more distinct and recognizable as human voices speaking in languages I did not understand, but which sounded consistent with indigenous languages of the Pacific Northwest. The voices were speaking in what appeared to be conversational tones, but with emotional qualities that suggested distress, fear, and desperation. Although I could not understand the specific words being spoken, the tone and rhythm of the voices conveyed clear messages of suffering and calls for help that transcended language barriers. When I mentioned these auditory experiences to my colleagues, they initially suggested that I might be experiencing effects of altitude, isolation, or the psychological stress associated with extended periods in the extreme glacial environment. However, when Maria Santos began working with the same ice core samples the following day, she reported hearing similar voices and described them in nearly identical terms. Dr. Martinez decided to conduct controlled experiments to determine whether the voices were psychological phenomena or if they might be related to some previously unknown property of the ancient ice samples. We established protocols for multiple team members to examine identical ice core sections under controlled laboratory conditions while documenting any auditory experiences. The results of these experiments were disturbing and scientifically inexplicable. All 4 team members reported hearing human voices when working with ice core samples extracted from the deepest glacial layers, particularly those sections that contained organic materials and what appeared to be preserved human remains. The voices consistently communicated distress and seemed to be calling for assistance or describing traumatic events. More significantly, when we compared our independent descriptions of the voices, we discovered remarkable consistency in our observations. Although none of us understood the language being spoken, we all described similar emotional content, speech patterns, and recurring themes of suffering and abandonment. Further investigation revealed that the ice core sections generating these auditory phenomena were approximately 4,000 years old, dating to a period when the region was inhabited by prehistoric indigenous populations who would have been among the earliest human residents of southeast Alaska. Archaeological evidence suggested that these ancient peoples had faced significant challenges from climate change, natural disasters, and potentially violent conflicts with neighboring populations. The voices appeared to be strongest in ice core sections that contained the highest concentrations of preserved organic materials, particularly those samples that included what appeared to be human blood and tissue fragments. Dr. Martinez theorized that we might be experiencing some form of psychometric phenomenon, where traumatic events had somehow been preserved within the ice along with the physical remains of individuals who had experienced those events. James Peterson, who was typically skeptical of paranormal explanations, became convinced of the reality of these phenomena when he experienced direct communication with the voices during his 3rd week of ice core analysis. While examining a particularly well-preserved sample, he reported that the voices had begun speaking in broken English, describing events that had occurred thousands of years ago, but using vocabulary that suggested awareness of modern language and concepts. The voices described a catastrophic event that had occurred during severe winter conditions, when multiple families from an ancient village had become trapped on the glacier during a hunting expedition. According to the communications Peterson received, the families had been pursuing caribou herds when sudden weather changes had made return to their village impossible. The trapped families had survived for several weeks on the glacier, using ice caves for shelter and consuming their hunting kills to maintain energy during the extreme cold. However, as their food supplies dwindled and weather conditions continued to prevent escape from the glacier, desperation had led to increasingly desperate survival measures. The voices described how the weakest members of the group had died from cold and starvation, and how the survivors had been forced to consume the bodies of the deceased in order to continue living. Eventually, the remaining survivors had also perished, dying alone on the glacier far from their families and communities. According to the communications we received, the trauma and desperation of these deaths had somehow been preserved within the glacial ice, creating a form of spiritual imprint that remained dormant until the ice was disturbed by our research activities. The voices were the preserved consciousness of individuals who had died in terror and desperation, still calling for rescue that would never come. The phenomena escalated during our final week of research, when the voices began appearing outside our laboratory facilities. Team members reported hearing calls for help coming from various locations on the glacier surface, always in the same ancient languages, but with increasing urgency and desperation. Maria Santos experienced the most disturbing contact when she reported that the voices had begun providing specific directions to locations on the glacier where additional human remains could be found. Following these directions, we discovered several sites where prehistoric human bones were visible beneath thin layers of ice and snow. Archaeological examination of these sites revealed evidence of the catastrophic events described by the voices. Multiple human skeletons were found in positions that suggested death from exposure and starvation, along with evidence of the desperate survival measures that had been employed before the final deaths occurred. Dr. Martinez contacted indigenous elders from the Tlingit and Haida communities to seek guidance about the phenomena we were experiencing and to determine appropriate protocols for handling the human remains we had discovered. The elders explained that traditional beliefs included the concept that individuals who died in traumatic circumstances could become trapped in the physical world, unable to proceed to the spiritual realm until proper ceremonies were conducted to release their spirits. Working with tribal spiritual leaders, we conducted traditional cleansing and release ceremonies at each site where human remains had been discovered. The ceremonies included offerings of tobacco and food items, along with prayers and songs designed to help the trapped spirits find peace and continue their spiritual journeys. Following the completion of these ceremonies, the auditory phenomena ceased entirely. The ice core samples that had previously generated voices became silent, and team members no longer experienced any paranormal contact during laboratory analysis activities. The human remains discovered during our expedition were reburied according to traditional indigenous protocols, with tribal elders conducting appropriate ceremonies to ensure that the deceased individuals received proper spiritual treatment. The research site was consecrated according to tribal customs, and ongoing glaciological research in the area now includes consultation with indigenous communities to ensure that cultural sensitivities are respected. Our scientific findings were published in peer-reviewed journals, focusing on the paleoclimatic data and archaeological discoveries, while omitting specific references to the paranormal phenomena we had experienced. However, the expedition fundamentally changed my understanding of the relationship between human consciousness and the physical environment. The Mendenhall Glacier continues to retreat due to climate change, potentially exposing additional archaeological sites and human remains that have been preserved for millennia. Each discovery provides new insights into the experiences of ancient peoples who lived in Southeast Alaska. But some discoveries also reveal that human suffering can transcend death when individuals die under circumstances of extreme trauma and isolation. I continue working as a glaciologist, but my research now includes collaboration with indigenous communities to ensure that archaeological discoveries are handled with appropriate cultural sensitivity. The voices I heard speaking from 4,000-year-old ice taught me that some aspects of human experience are preserved in ways that science cannot fully explain, and that the boundary between past and present is not as absolute as we might assume. The Mendenhall Glacier holds thousands of years of human history within its frozen layers, and as climate change continues to accelerate glacial retreat, we must be prepared to encounter evidence of tragedies that occurred long before written history began. Some of those tragedies left behind more than just physical remains, and the voices of the ancient dead still call from the ice, seeking the peace that was denied to them in life. My name is Jaylin, and I am a 25-year-old traveling nurse contracted with Alaska Regional Hospital in Anchorage. What I experienced during a December 2023 drive between Anchorage and Seward challenged everything I thought I knew about highway safety and revealed the existence of a human predator who had been hunting lone travelers along one of Alaska's most beautiful but dangerous roadways. The 4 hours of terror I endured during that journey taught me that some of the greatest dangers in Alaska come not from wildlife or weather, but from human beings who understand how to exploit the state's isolation and darkness for their own twisted purposes. I had been working as a traveling nurse in Alaska for 18 months when this incident occurred, specializing in emergency medicine and trauma care at hospitals throughout the state. The flexibility of traveling nurse contracts allowed me to experience different communities and healthcare systems while earning higher wages than permanent positions offered. My current assignment required me to work rotating shifts between Anchorage Regional Hospital and Providence Seward Medical Center, necessitating frequent drives along the Seward Highway. The Seward Highway is widely considered one of America's most scenic routes, stretching 127 miles through some of Alaska's most spectacular wilderness between Anchorage and the coastal town of Seward. During summer months, the highway attracts thousands of tourists who come to experience views of glaciers, mountains, and pristine wilderness areas. However, during December, the route becomes one of Alaska's most dangerous roads due to extreme weather conditions, limited daylight, and long stretches with no cellular service or emergency assistance. My December 15th assignment required me to drive from Anchorage to Seward for a 3-day shift, covering emergency department staffing shortages during the Christmas holiday season. I departed Anchorage around 6 p.m., planning to reach Seward by 10 p.m. under normal winter driving conditions. The weather forecast predicted light snow and temperatures around 15 degrees Fahrenheit, typical conditions for mid-December travel. The drive began normally, with light traffic consisting mainly of local residents and commercial vehicles making routine trips between communities. I had made this drive dozens of times and was familiar with the road conditions, dangerous curves, and areas where weather could change rapidly. My Honda CR-V was equipped with winter tires, emergency supplies, and communication equipment required for safe travel on remote Alaska highways. It was approximately 40 miles south of Anchorage, near the Girdwood area, that I first became aware of being followed by another vehicle. A large pickup truck had been maintaining the same distance behind me for several miles, matching my speed through various traffic conditions and road curves. Initially, I assumed this was coincidental, as many travelers use similar speeds and following distances during winter highway travel. However, when I reduced my speed to test whether the vehicle was specifically following me, the pickup truck also slowed down, maintaining the exact same distance behind my vehicle. When I accelerated slightly, the truck matched my speed increase precisely. After several more tests, I became convinced that the driver was deliberately following me, rather than simply traveling in the same direction. The realization that I was being deliberately followed created immediate concern about my safety, particularly given the remote location and limited options for seeking assistance. The Seward Highway passes through vast wilderness areas with no services or populated areas for dozens of miles at a time. Cellular phone service was sporadic at best, and emergency response times could be measured in hours rather than minutes. I attempted to get a clear view of the following vehicle using my rearview mirror, but the driver had positioned his headlights to create maximum glare, making it impossible to see details about the truck or its occupant. The deliberate positioning of the lights suggested that the driver was experienced in pursuing and intimidating other vehicles, and that this was not a random or accidental encounter. When I reached the small community of Indian, Alaska, I decided to pull into the gas station parking area to see how the following vehicle would respond. Instead of continuing south on the highway, the pickup truck also pulled into the gas station and parked approximately 50 yards away, with the driver remaining in the vehicle while apparently observing my activities. I went inside the gas station and explained my situation to the clerk, asking if I could use their landline telephone to contact the Alaska State Troopers. The clerk, an older man who had worked at the station for many years, immediately expressed concern and explained that I was not the first woman to report being followed by a pickup truck along this section of highway. According to the clerk, at least 3 other women had stopped at the station during recent weeks to report being followed by what appeared to be the same vehicle. In each case, the truck had maintained pursuit for dozens of miles before the women had managed to reach populated areas where they could seek assistance. None of the previous incidents had been reported to law enforcement, and the women had assumed they had successfully evaded their pursuer. When I contacted the Alaska State Troopers by telephone, the dispatcher informed me that they had received several reports of suspicious vehicle activity along the Seward Highway during the past month, including incidents involving lone female drivers being followed and apparently stalked by an unidentified pickup truck. trooper was dispatched to my location, but the response time would be at least 30 minutes due to the remote location. While waiting for law enforcement to arrive, I remained inside the gas station and observed the pickup truck through the windows. The vehicle appeared to be a dark-colored Ford F-150 or similar model, with modifications including oversized tires, additional lighting equipment, and what appeared to be a CB radio antenna. The truck was positioned so that it had clear sight lines to both the gas station entrance and the highway approaches, suggesting that the driver was experienced in surveillance techniques. Most disturbing was the realization that the driver appeared to be monitoring radio communications, as evidenced by his quick response to the arrival of the Alaska State Trooper. When Trooper Williams arrived at the gas station, the pickup truck immediately departed, driving north toward Anchorage at high speed and avoiding any contact with law enforcement. Trooper Williams explained that the incidents I had described were part of a pattern of stalking behavior that had been reported along multiple Alaska highways during the winter months. The perpetrator appeared to target lone female drivers during evening hours when visibility was limited and emergency assistance was difficult to obtain. The remote nature of Alaska highways provided perfect conditions for this type of predatory behavior. The trooper recommended that I remain at the gas station until additional law enforcement units could escort me to Seward, but operational demands meant that escort services might not be available for several hours. As an alternative, he suggested that I modify my travel plans by staying overnight in a populated area and completing the trip to Seward during daylight hours, when the risks would be significantly reduced. I decided to continue my journey to Seward, but with additional safety precautions, including maintaining constant radio contact with Alaska State Troopers and following a planned route that would take me through areas where emergency assistance would be more readily available if needed. Trooper Williams provided me with specific radio frequencies and check-in procedures that would allow law enforcement to track my progress and respond quickly if problems developed. The continuation of my journey proceeded without incident for approximately 20 miles, during which I maintained regular radio contact with dispatch and reported my location at predetermined checkpoints. However, when I reached the area near Turnagain Pass, the pickup truck reappeared in my rearview mirror, apparently having used alternate routes to intercept my travel path. This time, the driver's behavior was more aggressive and threatening than during the initial pursuit. The truck moved much closer to my vehicle, tailgating at distances that made safe driving extremely difficult under winter road conditions. The driver used his high-beam headlights and additional lighting equipment to create disorienting glare, effects that made it difficult for me to see the road clearly. More alarming was the driver's use of his vehicle to force me toward the shoulder of the highway, apparently attempting to cause an accident or force me to stop in an isolated location. I realized that this was not simple harassment or intimidation, but an active attempt to disable my vehicle and prevent me from reaching safety. I immediately contacted Alaska State Troopers via emergency radio and reported that I was being actively pursued and threatened by the same vehicle that had followed me earlier. Dispatch advised me to maintain my current speed and direction, while multiple law enforcement units were dispatched to intercept the pursuing vehicle. The situation escalated when the pickup truck began ramming the rear of my vehicle, causing significant damage to my bumper and rear hatch while attempting to force me off the roadway. The driver was clearly attempting to disable my vehicle or cause an accident that would leave me stranded in a remote location where he could complete whatever he had planned. Using defensive driving techniques I had learned during emergency vehicle operation training, I managed to maintain control of my vehicle while avoiding being forced off the highway. However, the repeated impacts from the pickup truck were causing mechanical damage that threatened to disable my Honda CR-V before I could reach assistance. The pursuit continued for approximately 15 miles, during which the truck driver made multiple attempts to force me off the road while I maintained emergency radio contact with Alaska State Troopers. The driver's tactics suggested extensive experience in using vehicles as weapons, and indicated that he had probably successfully abducted previous victims using similar methods. Law enforcement intervention occurred when Alaska State Trooper units positioned themselves at strategic locations along the highway and used coordinated tactics to surround the pursuing vehicle. The pickup truck was boxed in between multiple patrol cars and forced to stop approximately 60 miles north of Seward, ending the pursuit that had covered over 40 miles of remote highway. The driver of the pickup truck was identified as Robert Hensley, age 38, a long-haul truck driver with an extensive history of stalking and assault charges throughout Alaska and the western United States. Investigation revealed that Hensley had been using his knowledge of remote highway systems to hunt female victims during his commercial driving routes, selecting targets who were traveling alone through isolated areas where immediate assistance was not available. Evidence found in Hensley's truck included restraints, weapons, and detailed surveillance notes about dozens of women who had been traveling Alaska highways during recent months. The notes included license plate numbers, vehicle descriptions, and travel patterns that suggested systematic stalking, activities conducted over extended periods. Most disturbing were photographs of women taken without their knowledge, apparently during previous stalking incidents. Further investigation revealed that Hensley was connected to at least 7 unsolved disappearances of women who had vanished while traveling alone on remote Alaska highways during the past 3 years. In each case, the women had been driving between communities during winter months, when weather conditions and limited daylight created optimal hunting conditions for predators who understood highway travel patterns. Hensley had been using his commercial truck driving routes to identify and track potential victims, then returning to specific locations using his personal vehicle to conduct stalking and abduction activities. His extensive knowledge of Alaska highway systems, combined with his understanding of law enforcement response capabilities, had allowed him to operate undetected for several years. During interrogation, Hensley confessed to multiple stalking incidents and admitted that his ultimate goal was to force victims off remote highways where he could abduct them without witnesses or immediate law enforcement response. He described his methods in detail, expressing pride in his ability to hunt human beings more effectively than wildlife predators. Hensley was charged with stalking, attempted kidnapping, assault with a deadly weapon, and 7 counts of murder in connection with the missing women. He was convicted on all charges and received multiple life sentences without possibility of parole. The case led to enhanced safety measures for remote highway travel in Alaska and improved coordination between law enforcement agencies. The incident taught me that Alaska's remote highways can provide perfect hunting grounds for human predators who understand how to exploit the state's geography and weather conditions. Every winter, when I see lone travelers on Alaska's remote roads, I remember those 4 hours of terror and the realization that sometimes the greatest dangers are not bears or weather, but human beings who view isolated travelers as prey to be hunted and captured. Robert Hensley will spend the rest of his life in prison, but the thousands of miles of remote Alaska highways remain as isolated and dangerous as ever, still providing opportunities for predators who understand that darkness and distance can hide unspeakable crimes until it is too late for victims to escape.